I'm the forage extension specialist with University of Maryland Extension, and hopefully you're all in the right place today. But we're going to be talking about some pasture renovation today and a little bit on kind of assessing your pastures, like trying to make some decisions on whether or not you need to be renovating or when you might want to be considering a renovation and kind of the steps that might go along with that renovation process. So this is actually the perfect time of year to be talking about this because it gives you enough time to be thinking ahead a little bit, putting plans in place, kind of starting with the first steps of the process. And then kind of, before it gets to be time to actually planting things. So thank you guys all for being here, and we'll go ahead and get started. Oops. So like I said, I kind of started off a little bit with talking about like why or how to determine when a renovation might be needed. And so I want you all to keep in mind that when we're thinking about pasture renovation, oftentimes if our pastures are unproductive or we've been having issues with something and we're considering renovation, that's probably a symptom of an underlying cause, right? So it's important to think about what might be causing that so that when you do go and renovate or reseed or work to fix that mistake, you can hopefully prevent that from happening again in the future and kind of increase the longevity of your pasture and make the most of your investment into seed. So there's a whole number of different reasons why renovation might be needed. If it's maybe a new field that was recently acquired or recently fenced in, or kind of wasn't being used recently, if the weather has been causing issues and a field got really mudded up when animals were there during some really wet weather. Drought could be another kind of weather related issue. Overgrazing, if we've had maybe too many animals in a given area, or they've just kind of beat up an area a little bit and overgrazed it, that might cause some issues. So there's a lot of different reasons, but think about maybe why you're having the issues you're having, so you can work to kind of prevent that from happening again once you do go through this renovation process. So some of the major causes behind low production, I would say the top three that I see the most are lack of adequate fertility to support like good forage growth, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Poor grazing or harvest management. It could be, for a hayfield or in a pasture if it was grazed, overgrazed, things like that, or unproductive species. So we'll talk a little bit about like trying to match the species that you're selecting for planting to your environment and your conditions and the animals that you're going to be using. So keep those in mind kind of as we go through. The other thing that I wanted to say right off the bat is remember that if your stand is thin as a result of some of these issues like poor fertility or overgrazing, then adding more seed is only going to be a temporary band-aid, right? It's only going to temporarily fix the problem, and then you're going to probably end up right back where you were. So be thinking about these whys behind why renovation is needed as you're going through this process. So I also wanted to start off by saying that, renovation, basically we're saying we want to improve the existing forage stand, right? And that can be done in a number of different ways. It doesn't always have to mean reseeding. And what I mean by that is it can be improvements in management that we work to make our pastures or our fields better simply by making management changes. This could be by correcting some fertility deficiencies. It could be by doing some weed control to minimize competition from undesirable plants or weeds. It could be changing our management a little bit to boost our productivity through grazing and becoming better at moving animals and using grazing management to our advantage. Same thing for harvest. It could be by tweaking some things with our harvest regimen and kind of improving our management in that area. So I just wanted to touch on this initially before we kind of get into the renovation process, because if you're like, well, how do I change my management to boost the production of my pasture? So we're just gonna hit on this just really briefly here at the start. And when it comes to grazing management, I always like to ask, what does a plant need to grow? Think back to like your high school biology class, right? Where you talked about the photosynthetic process. Those plants need light energy from the sun, right? And they're converting carbon dioxide into oxygen, taking up water and minerals from the soil. So essentially, we can think of all the plants in our pasture as little miniature solar panels, right? They rely very heavily on that light energy from the sun and need that to grow and be productive. And so if we think about plants as little solar panels, there's two places where plants can get energy for regrowth from. The first place is leaf area from those little solar panel leaves. And remember in this case that only green and growing leaves can actively carry out photosynthesis. So, in this example, in these pictures on the right, up here on the top one, we have a plant that was grazed a little bit more heavily. You can see there's less leaf matter here remaining versus this one down here on the bottom, which was grazed a little bit more lightly, still grazed off the top, but there's a lot more leaf area remaining there. So this plant is going to be much more productive, is going to have a much higher, much more rapid rate of photosynthesis, and is going to grow back a lot faster than the plant in the top picture. And then the other place where plants get their energy for regrowth from is stored carbohydrates. So most grasses, so like orchard grass, tall fescue, timothy, etc., store a lot of their energy reserves in the base of the stem. So like the lower 3 or 4 inches, kind of the bottom of the plant. And so we want to preserve those as much as possible. So we're preserving the energy reserves for that plant so that that plant is able to be healthy, stay strong, grow back really rapidly, and outcompete any of those weeds or other undesirable plants. So if we think about management in the renovation process, the goal is to maybe leave a little bit more forage in the field and preserve the longevity of our plants. So if we have that lower grazing height that we talked about, so they're grazed down a little tighter, we're leaving less leaf area for photosynthesis, and we have less of those stored carbohydrates remaining. So we're kind of setting that plant up for failure, essentially, right? But if we use a little bit higher grazing height, if we're, using rotational grazing, we're moving our animals around, we're leaving more leaf area so that plant can continue to photosynthesize. And we're also leaving a higher amount of those stored carbohydrates remaining. So that plant is going to be much better set up for success and is going to be able to survive a lot better in drought or in bad weather conditions, or, if the fertility is a little bit lacking, or all of those situations, it's going to be much more resilient. And so how do we do this with our grazing management? Well, essentially, you guys probably know where I'm going with this. We control it using time. So rotational grazing, amount of time and animals are spending in a given area, and then how quickly they're returning to the same area. And so they've done a lot of work looking into, of course, the advantages of using a rotational grazing system and moving animals through different fields and across different areas. And so you can see here that in this figure on the left-hand side, over here, we have a plant that was grazed down a lot tighter, removed a lot more of the leaf material, versus a plant where they didn't remove very much of the leaf material, was only very lightly grazed. And then, some in between ones. And you can see that as we graze a lot tighter, as we remove more of that leaf material, we also have a lot less root growth happening below the soil surface. So these plants over here, this one and the one on the far right, are going to have a lot better chance of success, holding up and being successful moving forward. So that's like how much time an animal spends in a given area, how tightly they graze the plants. And then there's also how much rest those plants have in between grazings, right? So, and that's what this example is showing. Down here on the left, we have a plant that was cut to 2 inches every single week repeatedly, versus cut to 2 inches every 2 weeks, versus cut to 2 inches every month. And you can see the difference both in the above ground leaf matter and also in the below ground root structure for those plants. So rotational grazing is a combination of two things: how long we have animals in a given area and how long before we return to that same area. And by using some of these tools, we can improve the longevity of our fields and make them more productive over time, simply by making changes in our management. So in a continuously grazed pasture, a lot of plants are grazed off every like 2 to 7 days. Animals tend to go back to the same areas that they prefer, whether that's, a shaded area, an area near the gate or the water source, or just an area where there's more preferred plants growing. And they repeatedly graze those areas over and over again. But as we just said, plants need some time to rest and regenerate their carbohydrate reserves in between grazings. So having that rest period is key. And so this is just an example of some plants that were grown in a greenhouse. And the pot over here on the left was meant to illustrate a more continuous grazing system where this plant was cut down to 1 inch height every single week. And this one was meant to simulate more of a rotational grazing system where the plant was cut every month down to a 3.5 inches. So there was more time in between grazings and there was more plant material left in the field after each grazing. And this picture here is showing both of them, after doing this multiple times. This is showing them right after cutting. And this was 6 days later. So you can see the drastic difference in the productivity of these plants just from, doing this little mini experiment in the greenhouse. So this is really what's happening in a lot of our fields. And if we want to simply improve the productivity of our pasture, one of the things we can do if we're not already is by using good grazing management and letting those plants recover quicker and stay healthy a lot longer. So just wanted to throw that out there as one tool that we don't often think about in the context of renovation for fields, but can be something that really does help us improve the productivity of our fields. So back to renovation, we mentioned this one here, making changes in our management. So thinking about soil fertility, weed control, grazing, like we talked about, and making changes. The next step on the kind of renovation scale, if you will, would be like doing some overseeding. So this basically means we're not eliminating the existing stand. We're not, killing off everything and starting over, but we're adding additional seed into that field. This could be, drilling it in or overseeding it in. Could also be frost seeding, especially for some of the clover species, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But we're basically just adding more seed, maybe filling in some more bare areas, kind of thickening that sand up a little bit. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have kind of the full replacement, right? So we're eliminating what's currently in the field and totally establishing a brand new vegetation in that field. And of course, totally starting over from scratch means that this one is probably the most costly of all of our different kind of strategies. So how do you decide, between these different strategies, what's the right fit for your field? Well, there's a few different ways we can look at this. Obviously, if you're comfortable assessing pastures, you can simply go out and walk through the field and assess the condition. But there are also a few tools that you can use if you're a little bit less comfortable doing that, or if you've never done that before. And so I suggest you use kind of one of these tools because they make it a little more quantifiable or a little bit less subjective, if you will. One of them is the step point method, which essentially is kind of walking through each field in a really random pattern. And every so often, maybe every 20 or 30 steps, looking down at the tip of our shoe and seeing what plant is there, or if there's no plant there, and making a note or a recording of these observations. And so what you end up with is something like what you see here on the bottom, this chart here, where we have different grass species, some clover, other kind of undesirables like buttercup or other things, bare ground, and then, a total number. And you can use this to kind of calculate the percentage of different types of forages growing in your field. So you can see what percent of my field on average is bare ground, what percent of my field is desirable things like fescue or orchard grass or clover, what percent of my field is undesirable things like buttercup or other weeds. And you can use this as kind of a tool to kind of gauge where your pasture is at. Another option is the NRCS Guide to Pasture Condition Scoring, which is basically has 10 different categories, and it includes things like, amount of desirable plants, amount of plant cover, plant diversity, how many legumes are in there, if there's any signs of erosion, and several other categories. And if you look this up, or I'm happy to provide a copy if people are interested, they describe very thoroughly in each of these categories a scoring system. And essentially you can score your field for each of these 10 different categories, and then you add up the scores, and that gives you an indication of where your pasture falls kind of in the grand scheme of things. And so, if it has a really high score, if it's close to, the maximum number of points, then maybe you're okay and you don't really need to make any changes. If you're just a little bit below that, then that's where maybe some of those management changes would help. So, making improvements in grazing management, checking our soil fertility levels, things like that. And of course, if you fall a little bit lower, then that's where you have to start to make the decision on, if you're going to be overseeding or if you're going to need to do more of a full kind of renovation. So this is just a very general guideline, but if you have kind of very light or light damage, so 70% or more of your field is desirable things, whether that's legumes or grasses or other things you want to see in there, then that's where I kind of lean towards, okay, we can work with what we have. Let's use more of those management changes to our advantage. Maybe we would frost seed if we want to add some legumes in, but easy, kind of simpler changes in management can probably get us where we need to go. If we're kind of in the middle of the spectrum where we have more, moderate damage, so 30 to 50% are either kind of weeds or undesirable things or bare ground, then maybe that's where we want to consider, well, we have 50% good stand. Maybe we'll think about some overseeding. Maybe we're gonna, drill in some new seed into areas that are more empty or that need a little bit of work. And kind of working with our existing sand in that way. And then we have, of course, the far end of the spectrum where it's a little bit more severe. We have maybe more than 50% weedy species or undesirable things or bare ground. And then this is where we might want to consider doing like a full kind of renovation or a full reestablishment. And you can, go right from what you have existing to planting a new field, or you can, rotate into some other things like grow a few different annual forages in between to really kind of reset the stage, if you will, and try to eliminate some of the weeds and the competition. So there's a whole spectrum of things to consider. And I know that was really fast, but hopefully that gives you an idea of maybe some tools you can use to kind of determine when renovation might be useful, or when you might want to just consider some changes in management to help you boost your productivity. So this is what we're going to spend the rest of our time on, is kind of going through just briefly these kind of 10 steps in the renovation process. So I broke this down into 10 steps, starting with, the first things we want to look at, and then ending with, management of that newly planted stand. So we'll just touch briefly on these different steps and maybe some considerations as you're going through it. So the first step is actually planning ahead, right? So some of these things can take some time. You'll notice back here, the first step is correcting soil fertility. Well, it sometimes can take a while to truly correct soil fertility, especially things like pH that are very slow acting. So this is where it's to your advantage to be thinking ahead, planning ahead, thinking about this in advance, months up to even a year ahead of time, if you have the time to be planning ahead for this, especially if we're using no-till plantings, because we're not working the ground, we're not tilling the soil, and we're only surface applying any of our kind of fertility changes. You also want to make sure you're allowing enough time for good weed control. So if you have some really particularly strong weeds that are hard to control, it may be that one single application of herbicide or one single tillage pass is not going to be enough to really get those under control. So you want to make sure you're figuring out what weeds you have in your field, figuring out the best ways to control those, and kind of back counting from there to make sure you have enough time to get those corrected before you go in and establish some new forages. And then the other suggestion is to probably try not to renovate everything all at one time, unless you don't have animals on your property yet and you're kind of, starting with a new facility or a new area. You obviously have to have somewhere where the animals can go, right, while the renovation is happening. So staggering this out a little bit can help not only spread out your costs, but also allow you to have some forage and some pastures to use while other areas are being renovated. All right, so we said step one was looking at the soil fertility. So we know that soil fertility plays a really critical role in forage systems and really all cropping systems. And we really should not be renovating unless we're willing to kind of set those plants up for success, right? So, you wouldn't start cooking a recipe if you didn't have all the necessary ingredients, right? So we want to be setting our little baby plant seedlings up for success before we even put them in the ground. So if you don't have one already, a soil test will tell you what nutrients are lacking in your field, where your pH is in that field, and we can be applying lime and fertilizer according to whatever those recommendations are for our specific field. Keep in mind that pH is a big one. So if you haven't seen a chart like this before, in this chart on the left-hand side over here, we have a more acidic pH, and on the right-hand side over here, we have a more alkaline pH. And these are all different minerals, and the thickness of these black bars shows the availability of those minerals at a different pH levels. And so you can see as we move to more acidic or more to the left side of the figure, some of those essential nutrients are becoming less available. So like phosphorus, calcium, magnesium. That means that even if these minerals are present in the field, they're not in a form that's available to the plant for taking them up. So this is why pH is such a big driver of soil fertility. It really affects a lot of the other minerals and their availability for plants. And as we move to more to the right side of the scale, those minerals like the phosphorus and calcium and magnesium become more available. The other thing is some of the nutrients that are potentially can accumulate or can become toxic in really bad cases, things like iron or aluminum, which is not on here, they become more available as our soil is more acidic. So keeping the pH in balance is really important to kind of maximizing where these minerals are available and at the right level. So for most of our forages, somewhere in the 6 to 7 range is where we like to see the pH. And you can see at this range, it's where a lot of those main nutrients are at their most available form. So, the phosphorus, the potassium, the nitrogen, those are all sulfur, those are all most available kind of within that range. And then, like I said, lime is one of the things that's really slow acting. So we want to be trying to get that out there and get it working as soon as we can if we're considering some renovations. The other thing, especially for new seedings, but really for all plants, is that acidic conditions really reduce root growth and development. So in this figure, you can see, over here on the left, this is plants grown in a soil with more of an optimum pH, versus these two over here are more acidic soils with a lower pH. And you can see the difference in root growth between those same plants grown under the same conditions, just in those different pH soils. And so we want our new established plants to be putting down really deep roots and being able to, draw water and nutrients from the soil. And so pH not only affects the availability of those nutrients, but will also affect the root growth and development as well. So an important thing to fix before we're kind of doing some renovation and reseeding. So we're not going to get into, all the nitty gritty of soil fertility. We don't really have time for that right now, but this is just an overview of the different nutrients that are needed by forages or plants. And just remember that the nutrient that's most limiting is what's going to hurt your productivity, right? For a lot of our forages, things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are needed in the highest quantities. So phosphorus and potassium are two of the big ones that we look at on our soil tests. You can look at some of the micronutrients or other secondary macronutrients as well, but those are kind of the ones that we start with because we know those are going to set our little new seedlings up for success. So just remember that before we start with renovation, poor soil fertility and or low soil pH are one of the most common causes of poor stand establishment initially, and also persistence of those stands over time. And this is just illustrating that with a picture. Picture's worth 1,000 words, right? These two photos were taken actually in North Carolina from the same field, so side by side strips. So if you look in the back side of this picture over here is actually this strip that you see in the picture on the right. So you can see they're right next to each other. And the only difference, this was obviously a new seeding, and the only difference between these two photos are in the picture on the right, they applied nutrients according to whatever their soil test analysis results were. And on the left-hand photo, they just didn't apply anything. They just planted, same planting time, same seeding rate, same new plants, etc. The only difference was they didn't apply any nutrients. And you can see really clearly the difference between the establishment in both of those fields, right? So this is why we say this is the most important first step, is really getting your little seedlings set up for success. All right, moving into the next steps, one of the other things we want to be thinking about more ahead of time is controlling our weeds. So we know that weeds compete for, light and nutrients and moisture from our newly seeded plants, and they can also shade out the crops that are growing underneath if they can grow faster and outcompete our new seedlings. So it's important to make sure we have our weed control adequate prior to seeding. And so this is just an example that I personally had to deal with when I was a graduate student up in Minnesota. This was some new seeding for a research project, so small plots, and you can see right when we planted it, looks beautiful, right? Our new seedlings are coming up, everything looks great. Well, you can't really see it in that picture, but we had a lot of annual weeds that were coming up along with our new seedings. And pretty soon the field looked like this. You couldn't even see what was supposed to be there because it was so covered with some of these annual weeds, and it was really out competing them. So I actually had to go in and weed out these little research plots, and it was a very painstaking work, but just kind of illustrating there, how fast those weeds grew and overtook our new seedlings that were trying to be established. So really important to make sure that we have everything under control before we go in and plant our new seeds. So in order to properly control our weeds, we need to make sure we know what kind of weeds we have there. So if you need help with this, of course, those of us in Extension are happy to help you with doing some weed identification or plant ID. Just wanted to include a few kind of helpful links for if you want to look stuff up on your own. Virginia Tech has a really nice weed ID guide on their website. We've taken a break from it, but I want to restart this again. We were doing some weed ID posts on our Maryland Forages Facebook page. So if you want to follow along, and as we restart some of those weekly kind of weed identification posts, feel free to check us out there. Another good resource is the Mid-Atlantic Weed Control Guide, which you can look up and get online. That has a lot of the kind of common weeds that we see in a lot of our fields. So we need to know what kind of weeds we have growing, because that will affect how we control them, or the best way to control them. So there's a lot of different ways we can control weeds. It doesn't have to be herbicides. That's one of the options, but we have lots of tools in our toolbox, if you will. So one option is really, I think the best option is maintaining a healthy forage stand that will outcompete the weeds. A lot of weeds are very opportunistic. And so if our forages are a little bit overgrazed, or, we lack some fertility, that's where weeds can really kind of get their foot in the door and kind of start to take over. So if we do a good job of maintaining a good forage stand, using good management, having our fertility under control, all those things, we're going to set our forages up for success. We can use mechanical weed control like clipping or mowing to eliminate some of the seed heads. Tillage is another form of mechanical control, especially if we're going to renovate and we're going to till anyways. We can use a couple tillage passes to get weeds under control. And then, of course, like I said, we have herbicides as an option, and herbicide choice will really depend on what weeds you have present. So we have, different weeds of different growth stages, which I'll show you in a second, and the timing of herbicide and what herbicide you use will really depend on what weeds that you have growing in your field. So I'm not going to get too into the weeds with this, funny if you will, but winter annuals are, a couple common ones down there: purple dead nettle, shepherd's purse, those kinds of things. Those winter annuals will germinate in the fall, overwinter, and then go to seed in the late spring or early summer. And so we want to be controlling these when they're smaller and still in a seedling or vegetative. So either late fall or early in the spring when they're still little. If we have summer annual weeds, these are going to be germinating in the spring and going to seed in the late summer or fall. So again, these are annuals. We want to control them when they're small, when they're in the kind of early vegetative stages. But because these aren't germinating until summer, our control is going to shift to more of the spring, early summer time frame. And then perennials, for perennial weeds, of course, those are the long-lived ones. They're typically a little bit harder to control, but we're going to work on controlling those either in the spring when they're kind of in their bud stage, or in the fall when they're kind of translocating energy down to their roots for overwintering. So again, like I said, it just really depends on what weeds we have present in our field and what type of growth cycle they have. And we're happy to help if you have questions on that or need help figuring out what would be a good option for you. All right, once we have our soil fertility set up, once we have our weeds under control, the next thing is going to be deciding what forage species we're going to plant. And that could be a whole other conversation in and of itself, but I'll touch on a few things briefly. So we want to match the plants that we're planting to our soil and our site characteristics. So what I mean by that is, what is our soil type? How well drained is our soil? How much moisture does our soil hold? What is the fertility and the pH of our soil? There are certain forages that do better or worse under, more well drained or a more poorly drained soil, under a higher pH, or they can tolerate a little bit lower pH. So we want to be thinking about that as we're picking forages to establish in our pastures. So this is just a really rough overview of some different grass species and kind of a range of what they can tolerate in terms of drainage and soil fertility and soil pH. So something like reed canary grass can tolerate more of this is very poorly drained, so very poorly drained soil. Whereas Timothy is not going to tolerate that poorly drained soil and not going to grow very well in that. So you want to be thinking about, matching our plant species to our soil characteristics. And this one is the same thing, but just showing for legumes. So same thing for legumes. Alfalfa is, something that's going to need more of a high fertility, a well-drained soil, versus some of the clovers can tolerate more of a poorly drained soil, more of a low pH, maybe more moderate soil fertility. So think about your site and your soil characteristics and kind of plan accordingly. We also want to match the plants that we're growing to our intended use. So is this going to be a hay field or a pasture field? Is this going to be like a long-term, really permanent pasture, or is this going to be a short-term kind of temporary thing, maybe using some annual forages or whatnot? What time of year are we going to be wanting to plant and or graze? How long are we going to be wanting to graze? What type of management are we going to have? Are we going to do a really intensive rotational grazing system, or are we going to keep it a little bit more of a simple rotation? So we can pick plants to kind of match the characteristics both for our site, but also for our intended use and what we're going to be using for a management system. For example, cool season versus warm season. So cool season plants, of course, as the name suggests, thrive in more of a cooler, wetter climate. They grow best in the spring and fall when temperatures are a little bit cooler. Some of the common ones are, things we see a lot in the mid-Atlantic area: bluegrass, orchard grass, tall fescue, things like that. Versus warm season, again, as their name suggests, thrive a lot better in a hotter, drier climate. They grow best when things are really warm. So in the summer months, examples, Bermuda grass, some of the native warm season grasses like big blue stem or Indian grass. And you can see, the difference in the growth curves of those plants. Well, in Maryland or the Mid-Atlantic especially, we're kind of in that transition zone where we have some cool season, or we have mostly cool seasons, I would say, depending where you are in Maryland. But we also can grow some warm season species as well. So you kind of have to decide, when are you going to want to need more grass for grazing? What type of species are you going to want to use in your system? Because that's going to affect the whole timing of the renovation process. We also have differences in like bunch grass versus sod forming grass. So bunch grasses are like what you see down here, and they grow in this big clump. They usually are more higher yielding because they grow upright. They put on a lot of tall growth. But the downside is they don't necessarily spread into these bare areas all around them. There's you can see this plant hasn't spread into the areas around it, versus a sod forming grass can spread via these, either rhizomes below the soil surface or stolons above the soil surface, and they can kind of spread out and fill in more of the bare areas. The advantage of these is they can typically tolerate a little bit closer or tighter grazing. But on the flip side, they're usually a little bit lower yielding. So again, we want to be thinking about our management and our conditions and what might be the best species that fits within our system. We also have things like grasses versus legumes, right? We know that legumes typically are a little bit higher in protein than grasses. They have a little bit more, some of the essential minerals like calcium are a little bit higher in legumes. They're typically a little bit more calorie dense, so have a little bit higher energy, a little bit lower in fiber. They tend to be really preferred by a lot of livestock and are capable of fixing nitrogen. So maybe that's something that we think will fit well within our system and we want to, take advantage of that nitrogen fixation and that high nutrient density. Or maybe we want to stick more with grasses. There's obviously some very good quality grasses we can grow as well. And maybe we want to, maintain more of a grass stand. So again, this is something to be thinking about and considering different options as we're deciding what's going to fit best in our system. And then the other thing we want to be matching is our livestock requirements. So depending on what livestock species you have, what what stage of life they're at, how many you have, how old they are, those can all affect their nutrient requirements and how much nutrition they need to be getting from their forages or from their pasture. So this is just an example. This chart is showing relative forage quality down here on the bottom. So we have a little bit lower quality on the left up to like a higher quality on the right. And you can see these are all different classes of animals. And as we move up the scale, their nutrient requirements increase. So they need a little bit higher quality. So on the bottom end of the spectrum, we have things like a dry cow, a horse that's at maintenance. They don't have a high nutrient requirement, right? They don't need a lot of energy or really high calorie forages. As we move up the scale, we get into more of like the horses that are working. We get into the like kind of young like heifers that are growing, maybe a lactating beef cow. They're going to have a little bit higher energy requirement. And then as we keep moving up, we're getting into more of the dairy production, more of the really young growing animals, more of the finishing cattle. If you're trying to, finish cattle or other animals on grass, they're going to have more of the really high energy requirements. They're going to need really good quality forages, the best that we can give them. So there is a whole spectrum, and we can again work to match the forages that we're using with what we're going to be using those forages for. The other thing with forage selection is there are a lot of different species, but there are also a lot of different varieties out there. So we want to make sure we're picking varieties that are going to perform well for our region. So there's a few different universities that do forage variety trials, and they have reports on their websites. We have only limited stuff here in Maryland, but Pennsylvania and Kentucky have really big, well-established forage variety trials. And so you can look through and see how have these different varieties been performing over time, which ones have been most persistent, which ones have been highest yielding, which ones have been, better quality, etc. And we can, again, try to match different species, but also different varieties with our conditions and with what we need. And always want to make sure we're using certified seed. So should have a certified seed logo or tag on there. Just make sure that the seed is high quality seed. It's been germination tested and all those different things, and that we're putting down the highest quality seed that we can put down in our field, especially for some of these perennial establishments that are a really long-term investment. All right, so now we're getting more into the kind of actual planting process. And so step 4 only applies if you have legumes in your seed mix. So I mentioned, the one potential advantage of legumes is their ability to fix nitrogen. And so they have this symbiotic relationship with bacteria that live in their root nodules. If you've never seen, this is an up close picture of a legume plant. You can see the little kind of balls along the root. Those are nodules. If you cut one open, it looks like this. And if it's a healthy, active nodule, it should be this bright pink, red kind of color. That means it's an active, healthy nodule and that those bacteria are working to fix nitrogen. So this is a big advantage for having legumes as part of a mix. But in order to really promote that and get that relationship established between the plants and the bacteria, we usually inoculate our legume seeds. Some seed will come pre-inoculated, so it's coated, and that coating includes an inoculant in it. So that's kind of the easy way to go, right? It already comes ready to go. But if it doesn't come like that, you can also inoculate it before seeding. Usually you can buy inoculant, it comes in a small bag. It looks like this black, really powdery stuff. And you basically kind of mix that in with your seed before you're seeding for your legumes to make sure we have it inoculated and we can kind of get that relationship churning right from the get-go. Don't forget that inoculants, it just looks like a black powder, but it's a living organism, right? So it will only work if those bacteria are alive. So proper storage and handling of that is important. Checking expiration dates is important. We want to make sure that those bacteria are not keeled over before we even apply them, right? Leaving them in a hot truck on a 90-degree day, not going to be great for the survival of our inoculant. So keep that in mind if you're doing it yourself. The other thing for if you're doing it yourself is different legumes have specific relationships with different strains of rhizobia. So this is just a chart kind of for your reference. You can see different legumes listed over here and the different types or strains of rhizobial bacteria that kind of work best with those different species. So most of the time, seed companies or wherever you're buying your seed from, they'll know which strain is going to work best for whatever legume you're buying. But if you want to check, feel free to ask and make sure that you have the right one. All right, once we have our seed, we've picked our varieties, our legume seed is inoculated, we're going to kind of move into like preparing the seed bed. So before we kind of get into the actual seed bed preparation, we want to make sure we're kind of eliminating whatever is existing in that field. So we want to eliminate extra residue because we want to make sure when we get to the seeding process that we want good seed to soil contact. And we want to suppress competition from any existing vegetation, especially if we're going to be doing more like overseeding and not like, spraying everything and starting over from scratch. We want to suppress what's there to give our new species a chance to get up and going. So if you have a field that looks like this, and you go and drill right into that, you're probably not going to have very good establishment success because there's a lot of competition there that those new seedlings are starting to deal with. So instead, what we suggest is either grazing it really close, like kind of overgrazing a little bit, or mowing the existing vegetation off. Will be the only time you'll hear me suggest overgrazing to kind of set back the existing vegetation, open up the canopy a little bit so that we give our new seedlings a chance to get up and going and have adequate sunlight and access to nutrients. Keep in mind if you are going to do this that you don't want to be overgrazing with your lactating dairy cows or your finishing animals because their performance is going to go down a little bit as you're overgrazing because you're kind of forcing them to eat the more fibrous, less nutrient dense parts of the plant. So if you have some dry cows or other kind of low nutrient requirement animals, those work well for this. Or of course you can also use the mower or other things as well. All right, then when it comes time to prepare the seed bed, this is where we have a big difference between no-till and tillage. So no-till, for those who aren't familiar, over here on the left, we have a no-till drill, and these are used to plant into the existing sod. Versus tillage, of course, is where we're going to be, tilling that field up, exposing the sod before we plant our seeds into it. And so, like I said, a no-till drill is what we would use for those no-till plantings. Essentially, these drills cut a slit in the soil, drop the seed into that slit, and then press the soil back into place. So you're kind of placing the seed down into the soil in a slit in the soil. And on the tilled side, we would be using usually more of a broadcast seeder. So that's kind of what you see on the right there. This essentially just drops the seed onto that exposed soil surface. And then there's these little roller bars that you see here that kind of press the seed down into that soil. So that's how you get good seed to soil contact in that instance. And what that looks like when they come up, the no-till drill, of course, is going to be in these little rows. Usually they're 6 inches in spacing, depending on the drill. But you'll see these nice little rows. Sometimes people will drill in 2 different directions. So this field was not done in that way, but you can drill, one way, north-south, and then drill east-west. So you kind of have a cross hatch if you want to kind of thicken it up that way. Versus the broadcast seeder, which is on the right there. Those were plots that we had in a variety trial that we used broadcast seeder for, and you can see there's no rows, they're just kind of randomly dropped onto the soil surface. So different distributions. Both are a fine way to do it. And for both of these types of establishments, there's a lot of different sizes of equipment available. So, you can get small scale, you can get really big scale. There's a huge range in equipment that can be used for both of these. Advantages of a no-till planting, a little bit less labor intensive because you're not having to till the soil and, usually a couple passes around the field to get the seed bed prepared. It's conserving the integrity of the soil. You're not ripping that soil up, you're maintaining the soil structure a little bit more. So usually you're preserving soil moisture a little bit better because you're not exposing that to sunlight and air. And there's less potential for erosion. So especially if you're on any sort of slope or hillside, you have much less chance of erosion when you keep that sod intact. With no-till, it's really important to make sure you're suppressing the existing stand. So we talked about that with the, grazing close or mowing, but you really want to reduce the amount of residue that you have there prior to planting so that you can get really good seed to soil contact. If you want to, you can also use, if you're worried about suppression, you can also use a low rate of an herbicide to kind of not kill the existing forages, but set them back a little bit to really give those new seedlings a chance to get up and going. But again, we want to make sure that that seed is reaching the soil and getting good soil contact and not just being planted into kind of the thatch of the existing vegetation. For tillage, advantages are, loosening the soil if we have maybe some soil compaction or things like that we're trying to remedy, or like big ruts that we're trying to get rid of. We often turn under some wheat seeds, although you can bring more wheat seeds to the surface if you're not careful with this. You can use this to incorporate fertilizer into the soil, which means it acts a little bit faster than just spreading it on the surface. And if you have, like I said, ruts or, things have gotten really rough in a field, you can use this to kind of make more of a smooth surface again. Working it the right amount can be a little bit tricky. If it's underworked, so not, smooth enough, then you have too much residue on the surface and it's too rough to really get the seeds placed well in the soil. But if it's overworked and if it's really fluffy and fine, then it tends to dry out really fast. And if you get a rain afterwards, it can start to crust on the soil surface, which makes it hard for those seeds to get through, which I'll show you a picture of here in a second. So the ideal seed bed for a tillage situation is going to be soft but firm. And I'll show you kind of what that looks like here. So this is an example of something that was a little bit underworked. So you can see those big clods that are still there. The seeds are coming up, but like it's still pretty rough, hard to get good, even seed to soil contact in that case. This would be an example of one that was a little bit overworked and kind of crusted over. You can see that plant was kind of stuck underneath that crusting and couldn't really poke through the surface to get to the sunlight through that kind of crusted layer. This is more of kind of what we're looking for. We want it to be soft, very minimal clods or clumps, but firm enough. Usually you say like if you walk on it, you want only a really minor, like maybe quarter-inch kind of indent from your footsteps as you walk across the field. So you want it to be firm, but soft enough to get good soil contact. The next thing is seeding at the proper time. So this is where we talked about cool season versus warm season forages. They're going to have different ideals for the right time to seed those plants. So for cool season, we have two options. So we can have a late summer or fall time seeding, or we can have a springtime seeding. Advantages for the fall are usually a little bit less weed competition, usually a little bit cooler weather. But on the downside, sometimes we have less moisture for a little bit drier, especially the last couple of years. We've been really dry in the fall. So this has been a real disadvantage for anyone trying to seed things in the fall. On the springtime, oftentimes we have more adequate moisture with, spring or early summer rainfall. But sometimes that moisture can cause a delay getting in the field. If the field is too wet, we can't get in on time. And the summer, as we get into the hot summer days, that can be really stressful for a new stand. So if we don't get it in early enough in the spring, then those seeds can be really susceptible to that hot summer weather. And we oftentimes have more weed competition from, both the winter annuals that have overwintered and also the warm season annuals and perennial weeds that are growing a lot during the spring and summer months. For warm season forages, these would always be usually seeded in the summertime. And for most of them, we just want to make sure that the soil temperature is adequate, so that it's warm enough in the soil for those seeds to be able to germinate and get going properly. I did mention frost seeding earlier. Essentially, this is just like broadcasting seed onto the soil surface in late winter. You can see in this picture here, this is us driving the Kubota around one of the dairy pastures, spreading some clover that we were frost seeding in to this field. This works not very well for a lot of grasses and alfalfa, but it works usually pretty well with clover. So a lot of the clovers are a little bit more of a larger, kind of hard seed, so they can do really well with the frost seeding. The key here is we need some freeze and thaw cycles to get that seed to soil contact. So what that looks like is kind of here. When the soil has this kind of like honeycombing shape in the like late winter, as the kind of soil is thawing during the day and then freezing again at night and then thawing again during the day, we can get like a little bit of this small kind of heaving, and that can kind of work seed down into the soil and get enough seed to soil contact where those plants can get established. So it's usually clover is one of the big ones that we use for frost seeding. It's usually the most successful, but that can be an option if you're trying to add clover or some legumes to your stand. All right. Now, also speaking of seeding, we want to make sure not only our timing is right, but that we're seeding at the proper rate. So, we know that seed characteristics vary. So I mentioned kind of like harder seed of like the clover, versus we have like a lot of grass seeds look more like this, kind of like broad, flat, kind of thinner seeds. So there's differences in the shape of the seed. There's also differences in the size. So this is just showing like a tall fescue seeds versus a Timothy seeds. So we have different sizes of seeds. So we want to make sure that we're seeding all these different shapes and sizes of seeds at the proper rate, which is why we have recommendations for seeding rates. And this is just showing an example. This is actually both annual ryegrass seeds, and it's exactly 20,000 seeds of both. I don't envy the person who counted those out. It was not me. But they counted out 20,000 seeds of annual ryegrass of these two different varieties. And this is a tetraploid variety and this is a diploid variety, and they're different sizes of seeds. So you can see it's very different sizing, even though it's the same species forage. So that's why seeding things at the proper rate is really important. So the ideal rate is going to vary based on what forage you're planting. But we want to make sure we're adjusting based on the seeds we have, what we're using, and also the planting method. So the drill, because we're placing seeds into the soil with a no-till drill, we can usually go on more of the lower end of the suggested range. Broadcasting, because we're kind of just scattering that seed across the soil, often we choose to go more on the higher end of kind of that suggested range. And then we also want to adjust our seeding rate based on the conditions. So if we have not very good conditions, we're, worried about germination or competition or lack of moisture, maybe we want to go on the higher end of the suggested rate. If we have really good conditions, we've had adequate moisture, we're not very worried about competition in the field, maybe we can get away with going on the lower end of that kind of suggested range. Regardless of what you choose, calibration is important. So, we don't have time to get into it now, but if you're using a no-till drill or a broadcast seeder, we want to make sure we're calibrating it so that we're applying the right rate of seed that we need to be applying on that field. This is just an example of some suggested seeding rates for a few different species. You can see there's kind of two columns here, one for if things are seeded by themselves, so a pure stand of orchard grass or fescue or whatever, versus if they're seeded in a mixture. Of course, if it's in a mix, we have other species we're adding in, right? So we can reduce the rate of each individual species because we're mixing in other things. So that's just a rough overview of kind of seeding rates and some guidelines to get you started. Feel free to talk to people in extension, talk to your seed reps if you have questions or you want to kind of tune that in a little bit more. Along with the right seeding rate, also the right seeding depth is important. So we also need to calibrate our the drill essentially to the correct seed depth. So we don't want to be placing seeds too deep into the soil or too shallow or on the surface of the soil. So we need the right adjustment to kind of cut through that sod and put the seed at that right perfect depth. For most of our forages, the ideal seeding depth is between 1/4 and a half inch, especially for a lot of the perennial species. So if we have, a heavier soil or a lighter soil, you might kind of go on the shallow or the deeper end of that. But we want to make sure we're adjusting that and setting our drill to not be planting things, an inch deep when they're only supposed to be 1/4 inch, because that seedling's never going to have enough energy to really get to the soil surface then. In most cases, we should actually see a little bit of seed on the top of the ground, like maybe 10% of the seed. So as you're out there planting, you want to be looking around, making sure you can actually see just a little bit of seed on the soil surface, because too often we tend to plant a little bit too deep. And that can be one of the most common things we see in stand failures. So because we tend to plant a little bit on the deep side, most of these aren't supposed to be planted very deep. If you can see just a little bit of seed on the soil surface, that generally means you're kind of more, in the right category. Access to equipment for those who don't necessarily have, their own no-till drill or their own planting equipment. Some of the soil conservation districts have a drill rental or equipment rental available. I'm working actually on compiling a list of which districts have what equipment to put on our forage website. I don't have that quite finished yet, but hopefully very soon we can have that to be kind of a go-to thing to check if there are drill rentals available. A few considerations with that: you want to make sure you have a tractor that has enough power to pull the drill. So if you don't have one of those, that's another thing you'll have to figure out ahead of time. Um, you may, depending on the district and what their requirements are, there may be certain things that they need you to do before you're able to rent it. And one of the biggest drawbacks is, of course, if there's a big wait list or a lot of people are trying to use it at the same time, you may have to wait a little bit. So that can be a downside or a potential risk from relying on borrowed or rented equipment. You can also, of course, hire someone to have the work done for you. There's a few people, across the state that do more custom work that will, you'll pay them a set rate and they'll come out and do everything for you. So that's an option. Again, think about the size of their equipment. So especially if you have small fields or small gates or tight corners, are they going to be able to get their equipment into the right areas? Are they going to be able to get through and fit through your gates? So make sure you're asking questions like that before you have someone come out to plant and then realize they can't even fit through the gate. So something to consider. And then the very last thing that I just wanted to mention was management while things are establishing. So as those new little seedlings are getting established, it's going to be a little bit, they're still pretty sensitive until they have better root systems. So one of the things you can do is allow them to grow up to maybe, 10, 12 inches, and then actually mow them off down to like a 4-inch height. This sometimes can be a little bit stressful on new seedlings compared to grazing, because you don't have the pulling action of the animal's teeth pulling that. Sometimes they can actually pull the new seedling right up, roots and all, if it's not well established. So mowing sometimes helps encourage these new seedlings to set down deeper roots and put down stronger roots without having the risk of pulling them up out of the ground. So that's an option if you have time or availability to do that. One other advantage of that is it can also, if you have weeds or other things that are, coming in strong with your new seedlings, you can also help eliminate competition a little bit by mowing off not only the forages, but also any of the weeds or other things that are trying to outcompete them. We also want to, especially during wet periods, avoid grazing our new stands. So you kind of want to baby these, new stands really for their first kind of season or their first year. So, we can use them, we can graze them, but we want to make sure they're established before we do that. And we want to try avoiding grazing them during, really wet periods, or if we have like a really bad drought, and we want to really avoid overgrazing them and kind of babying them a little bit until they get a little bit better established. Again, remember that grazing management is really important. This is the same slide we saw earlier. We know that, grazing can really affect the energy reserves of those plants. So especially if we have a new stand and we want it to last a long time. We want to make sure that we're doing a good job with our management to really set that stand up for success and preserve it for the long run. So that was kind of, I know I covered a lot in a short amount of time, but that was kind of an overview of all the different steps in the renovation process. Um, some of the most common mistakes that we see, I mentioned a few of these throughout, but things like, failure to soil test or fertilize and kind of set those plants up for success. Weed control or other things that are out competing those new seedlings can be a reason. Poor seed bed preparation, if we have a lot of competition from other things, or if we don't get good seed to soil contact, that can be an establishment mistake. Wrong time of year, making sure we're setting those plants up for success and planting them at the time of year when they're meant to germinate and grow. And then improper planting depth. So I mentioned planting things a little bit too deep. That can be a common cause for establishment mistakes. And of course, I know the weather also plays a role in that, right? So obviously, I would hope people are not trying to drive through a field if their tractor tires are sinking in the mud, but things like drought or lack of moisture sometimes are unpredictable. So that one is a little bit out of our control. But hopefully, if we've done our homework and really set the stand up for success, we can hopefully set our stand up for success and good establishment and minimize the effects of things that are out of our control. So that was everything I had. I know I'm like kind of right at the time now. I'm happy to take questions if people have them. I have a few minutes. Hopefully Leanne does too. We can stick around if there are questions. If not, if you want to follow up with me, my contact information is up there. Feel free to shoot me an email or give me a phone call, and we're happy to answer further questions that you guys might have. I don't remember if we said this at the beginning, but we will get a copy of these slides out to everybody. So we will be sharing, a copy of the slides with everyone, as well as posting the recording on the website if you want to refer back to it at all. So.
Great. If anyone has any questions, you can either type them in or we can unmute you. Got a comment on excellent presentation. It was very comprehensive and it was a lot of information. So very good.
Thank you. Yeah, I know I had to cram a lot into a short amount of time. So hopefully that was easy enough to follow. And I saw Leanne put the upcoming webinars in the chat too for anyone who wants to know about what else is coming up.
Looks like Gina might have a question. I'm not sure.
Not a question, but just a thank you so very much.
Oh,
I'm trying to work this computer. I'm not computer savvy at all. So I don't have a picture of myself, but I just want to thank you, and especially for the lagoons, because I just started this process and I have horses, so it's hard to know, in which direction, because everybody has some advice
yeah.
as to what's best. So I'm grateful that you were able to explain the cold, the warm, and what works best, because I'm here in Virginia, which borders you. So we never know what kind of weather we're going to have here,
Yeah, we can relate.
Yeah, but I'm just thankful that I was able to learn quite a few things that I didn't know.
Well, great.
So again, thank you, Amanda.
Oh, thank you so much.
Leanne.
I'm so happy to hear that it was helpful. So.
Very good. Thank you. If not seeing any more questions, obviously, again, contact Amanda here. The information's here if you do have more questions. But thank you, everyone, for joining us. And I guess we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.
Bye.